Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, September 19th, and my mind has been completely preoccupied with Israel. It's taking up way too much bandwidth, and I'm wondering if I need to be should this be the thing I'm focusing on? I mean, my X feed now is just full of people that are onto Israel, and for me, it's very exciting, and I'm
Yeah,
seeing it,
yeah,
and I'm all about this. Like
right.
everybody's noticing, and that's fixating. That's just I'm just thinking about it constantly. But I know there's a lot of other things going on in the world.
Right.
What should I be focusing on this? What's the big?
Well, it is important. It is extremely important. I know that Alexander Mercouris always says that the battle that is determining the future of this planet is being fought in Ukraine, and he's probably right. But I think that's maybe something of a European perspective. Within the U.S., it's a little different, I believe, because Israel is much more important to the U.S. It's become a part of the U.S. in essence. It's become, embedded in our culture, in our government. It's the consequences of this war in Gaza and just in the Middle East in general is, I think, actually quite a bit greater for the U.S. than it is for Europe. I mean, it matters all around, but this is so. In other words, for you to focus on Israel, to be obsessed with it, actually, you're kind of reflecting, again, the an American reality. I mean, this is something you're noticing something because other people are really noticing, and it really matters to them. And it's going to have consequences, political and cultural consequences, religious consequences. It's something that's really potentially can really shake up and change American society.
So, what should we do now that we're noticing? Like, I mean, we can talk about it. I mean, I think that's a big part of it. It's just starting to spread like wildfire. Everybody
Yeah.
is becoming aware, but should we be like calling our congressman? Should we, like, well, what is it that we can do to actually, if we are identifying a problem that Israel has become melded with the United States and we want to separate that, how do we go about doing that?
hmm Yeah, well, all those things are important. A certain amount of activism, yeah, calls and emails to congressmen, that kind of thing. But talking with friends, whatever you're good at, I think is what it is. We all have our strengths and weaknesses, and so I think we individually just have to decide what it is that we can do. Is something that we really care about? Yeah, we talk about with friends and acquaintances. Maybe that's one thing. Family members, perhaps that doesn't work. You'll know from experience, but um, or you get online. There are a lot of people who are just social media whizzes, and they can amplify this concern about Israel, through their online activities.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of what I've been doing. I've just been going through and liking everybody that is calling out Israel, pointing out these issues. But now my X feed, that's why it's completely that because it almost feels like my part of my duty that we're in this kind of war, and I need to keep on amplifying, like you said, these voices, pointing out the problems. And it's happening. It's happening in real time. And there's some big names really doing some great stuff. I mean, it's really been interesting watching Candace Owens. I used to always go to bed listening to Alexander Mercouris and he'd put me to sleep. But recently I started listening to Candace Owens, and just because she's just doing basically the FBI's job, putting together this Charlie Kirk assassination stuff, building a timeline. And it's just wild. This whole thing is wild. It just, we're everybody's onto them. They're not getting away with it. So I just can't. I can't look away. I don't want to see what happens. Do you have any idea what's going to happen?
Right. Yeah. I don't know. This is very, like I've said, these kind of things are very, very hard to predict. But it's clear that the tide is turning against Israel. And, kind of at the opposite extreme of Candace Owens is The Economist, which is, a rather staid and really, historically very is, not just historically, it is a neoconservative publication. One of the leading neoconservative publications that's been, in general, very, very supportive of Israel. And I saw just yesterday that they acknowledged they did a poll together with YouGov and found, again, that the that the U.S. is really turning against Israel. They had noticed it in Europe already. They were seeing that. They were finding it, not just through polls, but just through conversations with friends. This is something people were changing their attitude towards Israel within Europe. But the U.S. was kind of holding out. There was still very strong support for Israel. But again, these journalists at The Economist noticed that that was beginning to change, and the poll work that he did with YouGov was showing it. Just give one example. Among let's say 50 and under Republicans are now evenly split between Palestine and Israel, which is a huge difference. Like again, you just go 5 years ago and they would have been overwhelmingly pro-Israel. And that was, I think Netanyahu and his people had seen even like 10 years ago that they were beginning to lose the left, and he just decided to really bank on the right, and now that looks like he's going to lose that too. So they're in trouble. Yeah, things are changing. They really are.
Well, the support for Israel just collapses in this country, do you think that will make Israel more reckless, more likely to engage in something, Netanyahu will, I don't know, attack Iran, do something? Because...
Well, yeah, I think the same kind of, he's operating really according to the same calculus that has caused him to take these reckless actions in the past. And they've actually, you have to admit, they have benefited him politically. First of all, there's the threat of the corruption trial. The charges have been brought against her, and he's being investigated for corruption. But because of these continual crises, which he himself is creating, he's able to pull out of these, or to inform the court that, sorry, I can't show up today because I have to attend to this crisis, and they accept it. It's happened again and again, and it's happened most recently with the Qatar attack, and now we have the Operation Gideon's Chariots too, and Gaza City. Just one thing after another keeps him out of this. So again, he still has that motivation. But more than that, I mean, a lot of these moves have been popular. Like his attack on Iran was very popular across the political spectrum. His attack on Doha in Qatar was popular. 75% of the population approved. And so, that hasn't changed. In the end, above all, he responds to, like any politician, the thing that matters most to him is domestic politics. And the domestic politics, I think, again, overall, though there is dissatisfaction, of course, about the hostage question, the majority are opposed to him on that, want to see a ceasefire. He can do all these other things, to maintain his popularity and maintain his hold on the government. And he will continue to do it. I think that's what we're seeing and what we will see.
You said bombing Doha, bombing Qatar, that was popular amongst...
Yeah.
Well, why? I mean, don't they understand that that's a big problem for them? Like, you don't want to make... most people in the Middle East don't like you, and the ones that aren't openly resisting you are the ones that are being bought off by the United States. Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. These countries... you're supposed to be working with them, right? That's the whole arrangement. That's the idea. Why would they be happy?
Right. Yeah. The whole Abraham Accords idea. Qatar was kind of one of the ones next on the list. We already got the UAE. Mm-hmm. Bahrain. Now we can get Qatar, but now it's not going to happen. It just can't happen. I don't think so. But yeah, it's more than that. It's also the hostages, because everybody understands the best way, really the only way at this point to get them released, or virtually the only way, is through some kind of ceasefire. And he goes and he attacks the negotiators. And he essentially just killed the possibility of a ceasefire for the foreseeable future.
Right.
And some of the hostage advocates and so-called hostage, I'm using their language. Most of them are prisoners of war. I think the vast majority of the remaining ones are. But their families, their advocates understood what happened, and they condemned the strike because they knew that was pretty much removed all hope of getting these people home, anytime in the foreseeable future. But most people don't think so much, including in Israel. And it's, hey, we're bombing another country. Great, this is another success. Even though it was it failed. He didn't get the Hamas leadership. He didn't get the negotiators, that he was trying to get. They still support it. There's just this reflexive support, for any kind of military action. And even when it's damaging to things that, they say that they're concerned about, I think there's just a lack of thought there. But that's the public.
Don't you find that kind of surprising that Israelis are largely supportive of this? Because they have to understand that they need support from the United States. They need support from the West in order to survive. I'm sure they're aware of that. They know the amount of aid that we give them, that their military equipment, it all comes from the United States, virtually all of it. So why, I don't understand. Why would they still be supporting these actions even though they know that it's putting them in a very precarious position?
Yeah, well, I think maybe like Netanyahu himself, they just can't believe that the U.S. will stop supporting them. It's just been a fact of life in Israel for such a long time. I think you could go at least back to, the USS Liberty incident. It doesn't matter what we do. Like what the USS Liberty was just, attack on the U.S. Navy. And or it was actually, an intelligence ship. It was an attack on the U.S. military, killing, 37. And very nearly sunk the ship. There could have been over 200 dead. That's what they were trying to do. And everybody who's looked into it carefully knows that that's what was happening. Yet, U.S. support for Israel only went up from there.
Right.
And so they just have the sense, this sense of impunity. We can do whatever we want. Okay, yeah, we can just, this is against U.S. interests. This is going to actually, the U.S. told us that they didn't want to see this happen, but we're going to do it because we know that they're going to back us.
Right, but that was
we've seen it again and again.
But that's 1967. There wasn't social media. Right. People didn't know. That happened. They buried it, and they were able to bury it, and nobody was really aware of it. I mean, people are just discovering it now. Almost 60 years later. So it's just like if you're an Israeli and you want to travel, you're a small country. They like to go to Europe. And the United States, go to New York. Every time they travel now, they have to hide their citizenship, right? You're hated globally because everybody can see it because there's social media. It's not like, they did the USS Liberty attack and nobody figured it out and they just could still go back and everybody's like, oh, great, you're Jewish and Israeli. That's wonderful. That's not happening anymore. Everywhere around the world, they want to go travel on vacation. They have to be worried. They have to be afraid. They have to be like, don't, unless they want to get in some type of confrontation with somebody. So doesn't that matter?
Yeah, no,
don't they care about that?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure some of them clearly do and are alarmed by it. But I guess others don't. I think, like maybe in the case of Netanyahu, he knows the risks, but he calculates them and he said, I got to stay in power and I got to, establish my legacy. I've got to defeat these foes of Israel and carry the greater Israel project forward. And yeah, there's a risk to it, but it has to be done. And then others probably just don't get it. They're still living in the past and they have the sense of impunity, which is, as you point out, is starting to disappear. I read this morning, this is a silly little example, but it was actually an Israeli a leftist Israeli that has taken part in anti-war protests. I don't know what nature, if they were, about the so-called hostages or about Palestinians. So I think the vast majority are actually about the hostages. But anyway, he's been part of the anti-war movement, such as it is within Israel. But he went with his family to a nudist colony in Greece. And even there, like you're up on this mountain by this waterfall, he got this hate because when people realized that he was Israeli, and he found it very distressing. And he had, I think in his defense, you have to say he understood why that was, but it was very distressing, And that's so if you can't, that just kind of tells you can't go anywhere if you're an Israeli without risking, open denunciation.
Right. I try to give people the benefit of the doubt. But with Israeli society, if so many people are supportive of these actions and they are aware of it and they understand the global condemnation with it, it's hard for me to wrap my head around it. Like, it's hard for me to find any way to sympathize in any way with how they're feeling. Like, I just don't understand the psychology behind that. If you can see what's happening. They know what's happening. They know that they're slaughtering these women and children there, and they're supportive of it. They know that everybody hates them, and whenever they travel anywhere, the people will shout at them and say, "Get out of here!" And it's just, if you want to have any type of redemption, you have to, within Israel, you have to speak out against it, right? It's amazing to me that there's so few people within Israel that actually care about what the Palestinians, the Gazans. I mean, even if they don't care for it just morally, do you think they would do it just pragmatically, just because, like, well, I need to do it so that way I can get support from the rest of the world, so that when this is all said and done, I can have a record and say, look, I was on the right side. Don't Nuremberg trial me, right? Even just to play it safe, if that's your only motivation, incentive. And it just amazes me that it's such a minority. Isn't that odd? I mean, I just don't think that would have ever happened. I mean, like in Nazi Germany, people weren't aware, of exactly what was going on. And I have a feeling if they did, many people would be horrified. I just don't
Yeah.
understand what's happened to this society.
Yeah. Well, I can't claim to understand completely myself, but I think part of it is actually this reflexive victim mentality, which has been fostered over the decades through Holocaust education and so on. This idea that we're eternally the victims. And it's almost, for a lot of them, they almost feel comfortable with it. Yeah, the world hates us. That's because, we're Jews and they're anti-Semites. And it's, the problem with that is it prevents any really, real reflection on what you're doing. It's self-criticism. It's just that you have this easy, ready-made answer that doesn't allow you to, introspect, but rather just point the finger at those anti-Semites out there. And I think that's a big part of the problem.
Okay, well, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think that we're going to see an introduction of hate speech laws in this country? Because that's where I feel the next step is going to go. But the thing is, the Zionists in America, when they start to pull these levers, now that people are onto them, I think it's just going to have the opposite effect. Because I feel like it's coming. We saw Jimmy Kimmel got his show because he said something about Charlie Kirk. From my understanding, he wasn't even that egregious of a statement he made. But I have a feeling that the reason that they're doing this, because usually, Jimmy Kimmel's on the left and the media is largely on the left. And so you don't see them kind of going after these types of characters. But the fact that he's got fired, and we have JD Vance saying, employers should punish their employees that are speaking ill of Charlie Kirk. I think they're seeing Charlie Kirk's death as an opportunity to push in hate speech laws, because we'll say that, oh, it's just so awful that if anybody criticizes his death. And then it's just a Trojan horse to put it in there and say, but, also you can't say that Charlie Kirk's death had anything to do with Israel, because that's what everybody is saying now online. And it's causing a huge problem. We don't know. We're still figuring it out, but I like that people are asking questions and investigating this. And, I have my suspicions. And so I want to see it play through. I want to see this happen, but it's scaring Israel. I mean, Netanyahu, everybody saw that video. How many heads of state have to go on air multiple times to say, by the way, I didn't kill that guy? It's nuts. Like, that's just not normal.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, the lady don't protest too much, methinks,
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, it's a fascinating phenomenon. First, about Jimmy Kimmel, I understand that actually what happened was that the head of the FCC threatened to pull the license of, I can't even remember what broadcasting company he worked for. Was it ABC?
I think it's ABC. I'm so bad with this stuff now.
Yeah, I think it was
it's
ABC,
though,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that really doesn't matter. But and because this was a Trump appointee, he was saying that this kind of statement clearly is not didn't meet some certain criterion of objectivity or balance or something, which seems ridiculous. You can't police individual statements, and it clearly is kind of just a politicized use of this regulatory body. Um, yeah, but it is worrying. First, I think I mentioned yesterday, like it used to be that all these attacks were coming from the left, the vast majority, and directed at conservatives. And I think that's just undeniable. That was it. So it seemed like this was the problem. And then the conservatives came into power. Trump took office, and saying that now, we're the free speech advocates. And then it turns out that no, they just turn around and they have their own definition of hate speech, which is, the so-called anti-Semitic speech. Really, it's criticism of the genocide, criticism of Israel, criticism of Zionism, which is, I guess it shouldn't be just too surprising, but it is rather disappointing. So yeah, it's like who was it that said, never let a good crisis go to waste? I think it was Rahm Emanuel. It's just like when when there is a crisis and the kind of the political temperature shoots up, you've always had a plan, something you wanted to do. You just take advantage of that. You just kind of hitch your carriage to those horses and go with it. So yeah, everybody's upset about Charlie Kirk and about the so-called radical left, and now you have the right on your side, in favor of speech. These you could say anti-free speech laws. And so, yeah, this is what you do, and then you join with them. But that the end result, when everything calms down, is now that you have a tool that you can use to go after critics of Israel. And there will be other. The thing is, it's going to go from the left to right. The right's not going to be in power forever. The left's going to be in there. They're going to be happy to have this tool to go after their right-wing opponents. I think we're seeing really kind of the beginning of the end of the whole ideal of American liberty. I think we really are going down that path now. It's not that free speech was somehow reasserted. It has just become, actually just a political weapon that's being used in this very polarized political landscape now.
Okay, well, that sounds a little scary. Do you think that they will actually be able to get away with that? What gives me hope with the pushing through a hate speech law is that the left isn't going to be on board with it. Just simply because the it's the right. And also this is just wrong. But then I think amongst the right, I think you're going to have a split because there were so many people on the right that were, like you said, were just all about free speech, saying that, no, you can't do that, no cancel culture, all this stuff. They will recognize the hypocrisy. Many of them will. And I see it online. It's like half of them will just, they just care about destroying the left. They don't have any critical thinking. It's just this stupid battle that they have in their mind. But I think there's enough people that are on the right that were free speech absolutists that will say like, hey, no, this is dangerous and push back. And even Zionist people like Matt Walsh are saying that like, oh, this is dangerous. So I don't think it would be successful. Do you, we're in a big battle.
You're probably right. There's just a danger. We'll see. Again, I imagine that what will happen if this bill goes forward, whatever, is going to be worded in some very ambiguously so that it can be used in various ways. And it just there could be a bargain among devils here. It's like, we don't really care if you go after those people, as long as you give us an opportunity to go after them, people that can be sacrificed. Who knows, You're right. There are still principled free speech advocates, on the left and on the right. They do exist. And, they still represent, they're not an insignificant force. And there is a problem, again, right now. I think, a couple of years ago, yeah, the left would find it wonderful to have the First Amendment somehow restricted. I don't know how you could actually do that, but just say. But there was open talk on the left, like the First Amendment's a real problem. It's allowing all this fake news and these people to spread these false ideas. In other words, often ideas popular among conservatives. And now we're hearing something similar on the right. We can't protect hate speech. That was something that the leftists used to say. So are now the leftists going to flip flop? Yeah, probably. So maybe, and there still are the courts, that do, by and large, defend the First Amendment. So the whole thing may fail, but there's obviously pressure to do it, and I think we see it happening regardless of changes in laws. Like these firings. Some of them I can understand. I don't favor. I wouldn't call up anybody and say fire this guy or whatever. That makes me uncomfortable. The whole thing. But some of the statements clearly were egregious and those people, if nothing else, deserve social condemnation. But many of the statements were actually just it seemed to me like legitimate political speech. And it's maybe not something I agree with, but it wasn't, particularly hateful or anything. And there have been professors that have been fired and, all kinds of people who I think very unfairly have been dismissed from their jobs. And this is, it's a worrying trend. Again, this is something that we used to see happening, to conservative commentators in the past. Now we're seeing it happen to leftists, and I'm afraid, regardless of what happens in Congress, it looks like this is something we're going to see more and more of. We're just like the old, the idea of liberty is something, it's actually sort of a rather extraordinary ideal, that actually goes against human nature in so many ways. It's something that had to be built up over generations. Is that okay? We may hate what you say, but we allow you to say it. That's actually not the way people, just like if you allow them to just go by their feelings and their natural inclinations, that's not the way they go. It's like, I hate what you say, and I'm going to shut you up. And I think that's what we're seeing, the kind of a reversion to our pre-liberty days.
Okay, so you think we're going to see this kind of battle play out then? There will be attempts to, you think that's what they're going to try to do, to pass some type of hate speech laws? I mean, they're already doing it to some extent, right? With non-U.S. citizens, they deported all these students.
Yeah, right. I think that, there will be attempts. We heard about that, even before the Charlie Kirk assassination. There was that, I think that measure introduced by MAST, right, to actually, I guess, empower the State Department to remove passports from people who are anti-Zionist. That could very easily be us.
Right.
I don't think it's going to get anywhere, but just the fact that there are being moves made in this direction is very, very worrying. And then even if the laws aren't passed, you can see that sometimes it doesn't matter. It's just like, people get fired, careers are destroyed. Maybe the legal architecture there is still there, the architecture that supports their free expression rights. But there are ways to punish people for free speech, outside of that.
Right. I think another thing that we might see is pressure being put on private companies, social media companies. I already think TikTok's been under a lot of pressure. And so I think we might see more censorship. I heard that, I saw this on X. I don't know if it's true. I should have checked on YouTube, but I saw people saying on X that this interview with Charlie Kirk and Patrick Bet-David was removed off of YouTube. And it's one where Charlie Kirk was questioning what happened on October 7th and was asking, was there a stand down order? He's saying that the story on October 7th doesn't make sense. And apparently they're trying to scrub that. And so,
oh, really?
Well, I don't know if they're trying, I don't know if they're trying to scrub it. I shouldn't say, I just saw on X people saying that video has been removed by YouTube,
Yeah, I haven't heard that it's being removed. I actually did see clips of that video, and I think it was actually made October 23rd, just a couple of weeks after October 7th.
Yeah, he had questions.
Yeah, so that actually shows that it was, he was having some questions, and he was willing to be critical of the Israeli government. even not just in the last few months, as we've heard, but he did, clearly he was asking some very hard questions and, very pointed questions about, October 7th. I found that very interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard that it had been scrubbed. As far as like TikTok, what the news is that a deal was made between the U.S. and China, and that I guess an American company or companies, maybe a consortium of U.S. companies, would have a ruling stake in TikTok USA. Um, but it sounded like, this is what I've heard. I don't, this was just one source. It would actually kind of give the control over, potentially give control over TikTok content to Larry Ellison of Oracle, who is a well-known, Zionist, and that could be very.
They're everywhere, man.
Yeah, no, that's no, it's not a. Just go look up his biography. He's a Zionist. That's who he is, and it is Oracle. I think would be the leading company. So that is worrying. And then I heard something kind of like you heard about YouTube, again unconfirmed. It may not be true that some videos were already taken down, or whatever you call them in TikTok, the shorts or whatever that people watch there. Some anti-Zionist ones. That may not be true, but there's clearly a concern there.
Right. So I think this battle is it's gonna heat up, as just the support begins to drop more and more. We're going to see them try to do more and more things to stop it. And I hope that they don't have enough control to stem that collapse, that it's going to have the opposite effect. Do you think it will? Do you think that there are attempts to stop it?
I think you're right. I think he actually, they've lost control of it. They used to have control over the discourse. But that is gone. It's, in large part because of the changing media landscape, the rise of social media, and that's just much, much harder controlled. I mean, in the past you had the three major networks plus PBS, and then you had like 4 or 5 major newspapers, and through and they were able to basically control the information that Americans consume. That's just no longer true. It's just so easy to do and run around them now. So that's a big part of it. And then it's just the behavior, the conduct of Israel. I mean, it's just that it's gone so, it's become so egregious, and its ethnic cleansing campaign, its Greater Israel Project has become so obvious. It was always there for somebody who really wanted to pay attention, but you had to do some research. Maybe you had to even buy a book. Like I remember buying a book about in the 1980s that really opened my eyes to it. Now you don't, a few clicks and you just start to say, wait a second, what's going on here? And you see the images you see, and so yeah, and again, it's just like it's not that. Again, it's a combination of the new media landscape that allows us to see what's really going on if we're willing, and then the changed the new spirit in Israel that's just so reckless and just doesn't seem to to a great extent, doesn't seem to even care what the rest of the world thinks about it. The old Israel did terrible things, but they cared and they were careful, and they occasionally apologized and pulled back. All those things happened. It just doesn't happen anymore.
Do you think that there was a stand down order on October 7th?
I'm not sure. I'm open to the possibility. Really, I'm just completely kind of, there are, I guess you can say there are two main possibilities. One is gross incompetence, and combined, which I think would maybe be a consequence of overconfidence on the part of the Israelis. The sense that Hamas, they're just a bunch of savages, and we're just so sophisticated, and we're so superior, they can't possibly do anything. And it was clear that they were getting information that something major was being planned, but maybe they just weren't worried about it, and it was just there was this real smugness. So it's a possibility. I don't think you can discount that. But then there's also evidence that, let it happen. Maybe a little bit of both, meaning that that like the Netanyahu government decided to let something happen because they're always looking for an excuse. that would actually be very much in keeping with um, Israeli behavior in the past. They realize like so-called terrorist incidents. Some of them really are terrorist incidents. Again, it's not so clear that October 7th was terrorist, but that's how it's portrayed. But as a so-called terrorist incident gives them license to do things, like we can see now. But I think it may be that they thought it was going to be more limited and didn't realize, how effective, how well planned this was, and in that sense we're taken by surprise. That would be my guess.
Okay. There's another thing that I wonder about as well is that our politicians often get flown over to Israel and then they go on this propaganda tour and they often talk about this video they see. And I saw Trump just talk about it recently saying, I've seen things, chopped up babies, they always talk about this. Steve Witkoff did that as well during his interview with Tucker Carlson, just saying like, oh, Hamas, these guys are just monsters. So like the clear message is that they bring these politicians over, they show them some weird snuff film, and they all walk away just saying that, okay, these people need to be genocided, they're just completely evil, these are not humans. And it's just a crazy thing. So like, what is this video? Why don't they share it with the rest of the world? Is it because they know if they do, then all of a sudden the millions of people, billions of people around the world are going to start looking at every single thing, putting like, wait a second, this is wrong, this is fake, this is that. But if they're able to control it, just bring you into a theater, show it to you, nobody gets to pause it or replay any part, just take a look at it, and you just walk out feeling sick because they showed you what looked like a bunch of babies getting chopped up. Like, it's just that's strange to me. Don't you think that these politicians would ask some questions or be like, well, maybe if we want to have some, or if they believe it themselves. So either they choose to believe it, or they think it's fake and they just go along with it, right? I mean, what do you think it is? If they choose to believe it, then they should say, well, okay, Israel, you're losing support. This turned me around and made me a big supporter of what you're doing. Show it to the rest of the world so they will understand. Like, wouldn't they put that pressure?
Well, I'm sure, I think we all know what's in that video. It's all the claims, the really wild claims that were made in the wake of October 7th. The burnt babies and the mass rapes and all that. And everything has been debunked, actually really very methodically debunked over time. But to this day, Netanyahu and other Israeli officials continue to insist. They start to bring up the babies and the mass rapes. He'll probably say it tomorrow, Netanyahu. It just hasn't changed. And I'm sure it's just they're in concentrated form. And there are things out there, in the, maybe it's not all together in one documentary out on YouTube, but I'm sure if you want to look at something about the horrors of October 7th, you'll find a bunch of things. So, yeah, I don't know, about that, why.
To me, it seems obviously fake. It's just, or else, well,
of course,
it's fake because we know
there's
that
no question about it. Right.
But why isn't there more pressure to show it? I actually saw it. I watched Fox News like a year ago, and it was Sean Hannity had Netanyahu on. And Sean Hannity asked Netanyahu, he's like, I think we should show this video to the public. And Netanyahu was like, yeah, no, that's a great idea, Sean Hannity. Maybe we'll look into that. It's very horrific, so we'll have to, so they were asking like, well, because he said the same thing, like, well, maybe this will help your cause, if people could see parts of this film.
Well, I think you probably analyzed it correctly. If you put it out there, then people can start just picking it apart. And then immediately there will be a number of videos out there showing debunking it, piece by piece. And that's one reason why they don't want to. I think maybe the Israelis just made this decision that, hey, this also makes the visitors to Israel have a sense that they're special. They got to see something that they couldn't just see on their screens back home. This is part of coming and seeing the truth in Israel. I think it actually does make sense from the Israeli perspective that they would just kind of keep it under wraps and just show it to select visitors. Mm-hmm. I heard that they actually showed that to Greta Thunberg and some of the other people were on that boat that was seized by the Israelis, in that earlier attempt to break the Gaza siege. But I'm sure it didn't have the intended effect.
That
on
video,
them.
yeah.
They knew, they were ready for it. They knew about it.
Somebody needs to like hack into these Israeli servers or something, get this stuff out there, just the treasure trove that they have. I don't know. The internet sleuths give me hope. I see it out there around the Charlie Kirk assassination. Everybody breaking everything down, saying, "Wait a second, this is impossible. This doesn't make sense." Audio files breaking down the sound, like, okay, from this from the sound, it was 70 feet away, not 140. I don't know how people are doing this, but they're like everybody. Some of it, I'm sure, is fake, but I just the fact that there's so much energy, concentrated collective energy around in the United States now to get to the bottom of this, and people are immediately looking at Israel first. That's the focus. I just feel like they're just in so much trouble now. People are just.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, again, I agree.
It's an avalanche now. It's
yeah.
like,
again, like based on, I can, I'm very, try to be open-minded about this as possible. I can change my mind just based on the things that I've seen. I don't think Israel was behind this, but it actually, I find it encouraging that everybody's asking the question, just to be honest. And you cannot blame people for asking the question because of things, of all kinds of incidents, like going back to the USS Liberty, where there should have been investigations and there weren't. They just weren't, or the Israeli art students just prior to September 11th or whatever. There should have been a full investigation, transparent, and it didn't happen. And so you begin to think, hey, well, wait a second, our government is covering up for Israel, and that's true. That's just that clearly we have covered up, various crimes that they've committed over the years. So it's just natural for people to say, hey, wait a second, yeah, I know you're saying that it couldn't be Israel, but I suspect that it was and I can't trust you to actually answer this question honestly. I can't trust you, the government, to do it. And that leads to still, I think the phenomena that we're observing now.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Listen to the Candace Owens episodes of the past couple of days.
I'll take a look at it.
And then tell me if you still feel like Israel maybe not be involved, or maybe, I mean, there's no, yeah, I mean, it's just everything. This whole thing seems to be clearly a setup. It seems to be clearly intelligence was involved. CIA.
Okay, I'll spend some time listening to it.
Yeah, it's. I don't know. It's just I've just been down that. So many people are tumbling down this rabbit hole, and it's just wild. It's like I don't have enough time, eyes, and ears to just sort of soak it all in. But it's very encouraging me to see that. I just feel like the dam is broken. And maybe it's just the fact that I am within my own bubble that is a problem with X. I've created my own.
You have a feeling that everybody is on your side, and that's clearly not true. There's still a lot of Israel firsters out there. Even among young people, there's still a lot of passionate Israel firsters, but they're not. They're outside of your bubble. But again, just like I was talking about that Economist YouGov poll. It's beyond the bubble. It's really changing. There is a real major shift in attitude towards Israel.
All right,
that's for real.
Nice. We're beyond the bubble, guys. I like that. Okay, so let's pivot to something else. The world's there's other things happening in the world at a rapid pace.
Right,
but I don't know what they are anymore because I've just been paying attention to this stuff.
Okay. Well, yeah, there are important things that are happening. There's the EU just passed the 19th sanctions package.
All right.
And, one thing, I guess it just ends all purchases of LNG from Russia, which will mean that the price of LNG, because that Russian LNG was, significantly cheaper than American LNG. So it's going to raise the price of energy further for Europeans. It's not something they need. But then also I think it sanctions or, prohibits all transactions with the Russian energy traders, Gazprom Neft and what was the other one? Rosneft, I think. Yeah. I don't know quite what that means, but it kind of suggests that maybe it's going to be difficult for um, for example, Hungary and Slovakia, who have been continuing to get um, oil and gas from Russia, to continue to do that, because I imagine they're doing it through, through those energy traders. Well, we'll see. And I heard that, I guess maybe part of the deal was that the EU was going to give um, Hungary compensation. Well, now if this is true, and like if Hungary and Slovakia get cut off, again, I'm not sure that this is going to happen, but that is going to further, um, increase energy prices in Europe, because that was actually just the fact that Hungary was getting that kind of eased some of the pressure on the energy markets in Europe in general. But if that's cut off, then yeah, they're just engaged in some sort of collective suicide. Europe is. It's just so crazy. They're so proud of the fact that they're depriving themselves of cheap energy, which is just beyond absurd. You just got to keep on, kind of pinching yourself and saying, am I dreaming this? And yeah, no, it's really happening. It's exactly what Europe doesn't need. And then, there's just the further sanctions. What they're going to sanction any bank that is plugged into the Russian equivalent of the SWIFT system, whereby funds are transferred between banks. Um, those banks will be sanctioned. There'll be more sanctions on the so-called shadow fleet. It all sounds kind of scary, but a shadow fleet is just one that doesn't have insurance provided by the
Lloyd's.
like Lloyd's of London,
Yeah.
right? Western insurers. That's all it is. So so they passed this, and oh, but maybe the most important thing I almost forgot is that they actually announced that they're going to seize those hundreds and billions of dollars in Russian assets,
Oh,
that have been frozen, and use them to pay Ukraine. And and then there's sort of like, they understand, like, actually there's been pressure to do this for at least a couple of years now, and the Belgians in particular have been holding out, because that's where I guess it's Euroclear is where the funds are, and they understand there are legal consequences to doing this. This is a clear violation of international law to do this. It's theft. It's outright theft. Say, well, we don't like Russia, we're going to steal their money, and we're going to
and give it to their enemy.
yeah, right. So anyway, so what the thing is, I guess that the agreement was made is like, okay, it wouldn't just be Belgium or Euroclear that would have to deal with the liability, because there could be serious liability here, but the EU as a whole would share the liability, like they'd all pay the penalty for doing this. But I think, again, that's just suicidal. What it does is, just like they're cutting themselves off from cheap energy, but also they're declaring to the world that we are no longer like a neutral, safe haven for financial assets. You park your financial assets in Europe at your own risk. If at some point down the road we decide that you're a bad country, we don't like your government, we can seize them and steal them, just like they've stolen the Russian assets. So it's quite remarkable that they've done this. Then on top of this, there's something separate. I think it's like Poland just shut a rail link between itself and China. It's like maybe the only rail link or one of the only ones between China and Europe. We're talking about, I think, some tens of billions of dollars in goods that are transported every year along this rail link. Again, kind of another act of economic suicide. The Chinese are probably not happy about it, but yeah, it probably hurts the Europeans more than it hurts the Chinese.
That's crazy. Well, we've talked about if they will ever seize those assets, actually confiscated, and just maybe we can expand a little bit. Is it really a huge, grievous error? Like, has there been an immediate some type of consequence from this? Like, have markets shifted, or countries like China, whatever, immediately pulling their assets out of Europe?
Right.
Because
nothing, I haven't heard it. This is very recent news. It happened today. Maybe just a couple of hours ago. I saw it. It was breaking news on RT, and I also saw it on from another source. So it's something very, very recent. The consequences might not be immediate. They may play out over the course of months. because a lot of times these are decisions that governments make, long-term kind of decisions. Where are we going to put our assets? But I think what we would expect to see is over the course of months is to, countries like China to withdraw more assets in Saudi Arabia and so forth to start moving their assets from Europe to other locations.
So, well, who's driving these decisions? It's not the European people. It is just the political elite. Is Trump pushing this as well to commit economic suicide? I mean, this is
actually, yeah. He recently had that True Social post where he said that he told that the Europeans had to cut their links, stop buying Russian gas and oil.
Right. The idea was kind of like you go first, and then the U.S. was going to do something, right? So is the U.S. going to follow?
Okay. Well, there was both. Okay, stop buying Russian gas and oil. And I don't think they've done it entirely. Like they're still going to be buying that so-called Indian oil, which is actually Russian oil. This is just so silly. They pay a premium just in order to keep up the pretense that they're not buying Russian oil. I don't think that has been affected at the present stage, but some of it clearly, like no more LNG. That was explicit. And that was part of what he demanded. The other part was the tariffs, on Russia and not Russia. Well, I guess maybe on Russia too, but mainly, more importantly, on China and India, the secondary tariffs. That's what he was asking for them to do, and then we can go along with it. And they didn't do that. They didn't announce that. I think there's real resistance to doing that. But again, these European leaders are crazy. Who knows? Maybe they will go along with it, and then the U.S. will follow up. It's not impossible. Just like they've been talking about, the pressure to do these stupid things just seems to be relentless. Like seizing the Russian assets. That's been there. I've been hearing talk of that for 2 years at least. And then finally, you start to think, well, obviously they're just not happening. But finally, they get their way.
So does that? Are you saying that means kind of like is this just like the end of Western the financial infrastructure? Like, is that a death knell to it, or is it just a severe blow and we'll see it crumble because it's like you can't use the Western financial system because if you oppose the West in some way, they will just steal your money. We now have precedents.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that just the fact that they froze the assets already was something that the rest of the world saw and was disturbing. So I think we've already seen, this shift away from Europe, from the West to safer havens. And, this is just a continuation of that. I don't know that this is in fact the death knell, but it's just like another milestone, in the decline, the increasingly rapid decline of the West.
Will this hurt? I mean, this is Euroclear, so I mean, you're saying that this will affect people wanting to park their assets in Europe, but I always feel like Europe is just kind of an extension of America. Is this also, reflective? Will this be damaging the dollar, the collapse of the dollar? Does it hurt the United States?
Well, it could. Again, my understanding, like the majority of those Russian assets were in Europe, but there was a large amount in the U.S. And so the U.S. may just follow up by with the same thing. That seems to be what Trump is implying anyway. We'll see what happens. The U.S. will have to differentiate itself from Europe, but I think most of the world looks and sees a kind of a unified approach, right? It's maybe Trump has done some things, but Trump is just again so unreliable, saying that to some extent he's distancing himself from Europe. But on the other hand, we get the opposing signals, from his administration and from himself. There's just no guarantee that, all in all, it looks like we still are pretty much acting as one. We have our differences or whatever, but it is still Western, American-led Western hegemony.
When Nord Stream blew up, there was a lot of talk about, it's going to be a really tough winter for the Europeans. Luckily, it was a pretty mild winter, and it seemed like, it wasn't a huge deal. Sure, energy was more expensive. It was a little tougher on the people of Europe. But do you think that with this additional cut, of no LNG at all and reducing the amount of energy, plus this war has been going on 3 years. We're seeing more and more opposition. The AfD tripled in power in North Rhine-Westphalia.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
do you expect, this winter to be a critical moment for the people of Europe?
Well, again, it probably depends on the weather. If it is a severe winter, it could be something that a real wake up call. That's true. But even given the fact that there have been mild winters, the consequences, the negative consequences, have been very, very real for Europe. The average European experiences, their energy bills have gone up. I don't know exactly how much, 50%, 100%, something very, very significant. And the energy bills, which makes life more difficult for the average person. But then there are also these very energy intensive industries that have suffered profoundly, especially in Germany. And a lot of that industry is shutting down or relocating to other parts of the world, like the US, where energy is actually much cheaper, right? So yeah, the consequences have been real, and it could, we haven't seen, people actually shivering with cold, but we've gotten close to it, in England and in continental Europe. And who knows, if we have an unusually severe Europe, we
Severe
could
winter, you
see
mean?
real suffering. Yeah, severe winter. Yeah, forgive me. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we'll see. It feels like we have just multiple crises converging. Do you sometimes think that as this starts to crumble, that's when leaders get more desperate and take more brash actions? Do you see a possibility of what's happening in the Middle East and Ukraine, Russia potentially converging?
Well, the potential is there, of course. I mean, the U.S. is backing both Israel and Ukraine. And Russia and Iran are allied. They don't have a mutual defense pact, but they're quite close. And China has made its support for Iran, quite close. There is sort of the pieces are lined up, and I don't see exactly how it could come together. But history is full of surprises, and when you already have, these forces aligned, um, it just, who knows? It may take one incident or a series of incidents to actually bring them in direct conflict with each other. For example, if in Europe we, if the European powers actually send troops into Ukraine, and the Russians respond by attacking them, and then it just goes on from there, and we have an actual war between NATO and Russia. And that's, God forbid that'll happen, but it could. It really could, because of the kind of crazy talk and the expectation that it will happen. That you have these leaders saying in 2 years we'll be at war with Russia.
Right.
One of the great dangers, I can't remember who pointed this out, but it may have been Jim Jatras actually. Just that you create this expectation actually of war, and I think by doing that you reduce kind of the barrier to war. That it used to be like World War III was unthinkable, so you just didn't do anything that would get you close to there. You just say, hey, let's not even think about doing this, whatever. This is just something that we cannot let happen, will not happen. Okay, we all understand that. Okay, we stop right here. That's, that taboo, you could say, has been broken. And World War III has become thinkable, and actions that could take us closer to World War III are being actively and publicly considered. So something could happen, where actually a general conflict between NATO and Russia breaks out. And if that happens, well, again, I think China certainly is going to be powerfully motivated to support Russia. I don't think they can countenance a defeat by Russia. I just don't think they can. They don't want to because they know that they're going to be next. They need Russia. Russia is protecting that northern border for them. Russia is an important source of energy, everything. It's just like Russia is very, very important to them. They're not going to let them use. So they could be drawn into it. And then on the other hand, Iran too is going to is going to be incentivized to support Russia. But then you could see something happening like, well, the Americans think, well, we need to strike Iran now. That's a soft underbelly of Russia.
Yeah, that's what I think about sometimes.
Yeah,
It's like, is
right.
that
So it's not. Yeah, we're just trying to thinking about things that could happen in the future. If this happens, then that could happen. Whatever. None of that is in the immediate future. But it could happen. Again, it's just like there's this talk of World War III. You see these blocks forming, thanks to the indiscriminately hostile actions that the West, led by the U.S., has taken against all of these powers. Russia, China, Iran in particular, and now India too. India is still maintaining its neutral position. This is something it's done for decades, and I don't think we can expect it not to. But yeah, we have the pieces lined up on the board, and they could start moving against each other at some point in the future.
right? Yeah, I'm just afraid that with things being just so chaotic and crazy now, and when politicians are in a desperate situation, I think they might have the sentiment, and I think maybe some people in general that have just been inundated with, the war propaganda for 3 years, that like, I guess the only way to settle this is just a big all-out brawl, and that's just so scary. And I just don't think people.
No, I think that sentiment is already out there.
Yeah, I think it is. So it's really real, and I pray that we can avoid it, and there will be enough people, here in the West that will speak out against this. But I just don't think people really understood, or still don't understand, like when the war in Ukraine broke out, what it really meant, why it was so significant. It's just that the U.S. has always been at war, so when it happened, it was just like, oh, or this was a proxy, we weren't involved directly, but it just felt like, yeah, these things just happen. It's just going to, blow over. There's always some few wars. They're always fighting about something, and I don't think people realize that. No, this is, the battle for over U.S. hegemony. This is the battle over the United States empire right now. That's what's at stake. And there are multiple cracks, it's collapsing fast. Okay, Dad, I know we got a hard stop coming up, so I think we should call it here. Is there anything else you want to say before?
No, we can stop.
Okay. All right. Thanks a bunch, Dad. Have a good rest of your day. And I'll see you soon. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.